And welcome back to another Unpacking the News. We're back today to talk government shutdown politics in Washington.
That's right. So today we want to look at the difficulties that Congress has had in passing the federal funding bills that are necessary to authorize government spending. This is the latest twist in a story that has been in the news in one form or another for several months now, if not longer, really. So as we record this episode, congressional leaders and the president are involved in back and forth negotiations to fund the Department of Homeland Security. Now that's the DHS for short. This is only the latest skirmish in a long-running battle over implementing spending bills that reflect the priorities of the Trump administration. But at a more fundamental level, these efforts are also about authorizing funding that enables the federal government to simply function, right? So trying to understand this latest chapter in these shutdown fights that have roiled national politics connects us with at least several key concepts and themes that we've been discussing in this class so far. Now, before we get into the current dynamics and make some connections with the class, though, let's start with some good background explanation from the Wall Street Journal that's going to provide you with some historical context for the current shutdown. Now, this clip is actually a couple of years old. It was made during the shutdown scare of 2023, which kind of makes the point that this isn't a new fight. But we're using it here because it does a really good job of summarizing some of the institutional and the political factors that have made shutdowns both possible but also more common. All right, have a look.
Constantly on the verge of a shutdown. For starters, the U.S. is the only country that even can shut down. Everywhere else, if a government agency doesn't have a budget for the new fiscal year, they just use last year's and keep working. But because 150 years ago, a bunch of U.S. agencies would blow through their entire budget, or appropriations, in a few months, Congress passed the Anti-Deficiency Act, saying it wasn't lawful to spend any sum in excess of appropriations made by Congress for that fiscal year. Basically, if Congress doesn't pass a new funding bill every year, agencies can't spend a dime and shut down. But why that keeps threatening to happen a century later comes down to Congress. For one, these spending bills are kind of their big thing.
The one thing that Congress has to do with the president is write the bills to keep the government open and working. There are a lot of measures that should be done or could be done, but this is the be-all, end-all of must pass.
So these spending bills end up becoming a vessel for all kinds of other things, like last year's. Sure, it funded things like the Department of Agriculture and Energy and the Department of Defense, but it also created the Alaska Salmon Research Task Force, renamed a bunch of post offices, and changed policy on the protection of whales in the North Atlantic, which environmental activists were adamantly opposed to.
Other things are going to catch a ride, and that's sort of the reality of living in a world where Congress struggles to legislate.
She isn't exaggerating. This is the number of laws that each session of Congress has enacted. Not only is Congress trending towards fewer and fewer laws, but so far this session, they're off to a really slow start. They're on pace to not even create 100.
If there's so few things that make it to the floor, it's the target. It's your opportunity to make a stand. It makes it harder and harder to reach those agreements in the first place.
In theory, they should be reaching those agreements with something called a budget resolution by about mid-April, but that hasn't happened in 20 years. Then they're supposed to pass those spending bills by the new fiscal year deadline, October 1st. Here's how many spending bills have been passed by then. It's been 26 years since all of them were done on time. They usually pass a short-term stopgap funding bill or a continuing resolution to fund the government for just a little bit.
And that's why it's seemingly that we come back in December quite frequently, and that's when the rubber hits the road for actually compiling all these final decisions on spending bills.
The ideological divide in Congress is growing. Republicans are more conservative, Democrats are more liberal. And then there's few members who meet somewhere in the middle.
Polarization exacerbates difficulties in the process here.
You can see it in split districts, too, where voters elected a representative from one party and voted the opposite party for president. Today, Congress has one of the fewest numbers of split districts in the last 100 years.
It reinforces partisanship. It makes it harder to reach final agreements where you have to reach across the party line. And it creates an incentive for speakers like McCarthy never to want to deal with the Democrats, but to deliver on behalf of his party's conference, not on behalf of what the Democrats want.
So a disorganized budget process, plus a lack of opportunity to debate things, plus a lack of motivation to compromise on those things, means funding the government is unsurprisingly a battle.
Look, I'm working everything we can to make sure this doesn't happen.
Now, even though that's a few years old, it really does fundamentally paint an accurate picture of where we are now. They did a really good job with that, right?
Yeah, they did. There's a lot of big things and little things I like in that.
Yeah.
Now, as that report illustrates, these kinds of debates over congressional spending authorization have been a recurring feature of American politics for several years now. Now, the last couple of weeks, you might have heard about the quote-unquote partial government shutdown that took place during the first few days of the month. Didn't last very long. Or you may have heard about the government shutdown that lasted for 43 days, a record in October and November last fall. You'd especially heard of it if you were trying to travel anywhere by air during that period, especially towards the end. In that case, you might have actually experienced that shutdown's effects. Now let's watch this NBC News clip from earlier this week, which sets up the current situation. Then we'll come back and fill in some of the background.
Congress is facing a major time crunch before funding lapses for the entire Department of Homeland Security at the end of this week. And there are no signs that Republicans and Democrats are anywhere close to a deal. Senate Democrats did release a draft legislation over the weekend that includes their wish list of immigration reforms to ICE and Border Patrol in exchange for funding DHS. And party leadership is not budging from those demands. They include targeted operations, no masks for agents, an end to racial profiling practices, among other things. Republicans and the White House have said that there is room for negotiations, but they've called some of the Democratic Party's demands, quote, ridiculous and non-starters. Joining me now is NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Melanie Zanona and NBC News senior Homeland Security correspondent Julia Ainsley. Mel, let's start with you. Lawmakers are making their way back to the Hill this afternoon after a long weekend. What are you hearing about a deal coming together before Friday? Is it even possible?
Well, a lot of pieces would have to fall into place in order for a deal to come together by Friday. But Ryan, there have been some signs of movement because over the weekend, Senate Democrats did formally give their legislative proposal to Senate Republicans, reiterating some of those demands that you laid out there. And notably, our colleague Julie Sirkin reports that a White House official says that they're not ruling anything out and that while some of those demands are more challenging, other demands are actually worth discussing. But at this point, those negotiations are only taking place at the staff level. It would probably take the principals, including President Trump, getting involved to actually clinch a deal. And meanwhile, GOP leader John Thune saying today that Republicans have their own list of demands, are intending to offer a counter proposal. So there's still a long ways to go before they actually reach a deal.
A long ways to go, Mel, and a tale as old as time on Capitol Hill because there isn't a lot of time. I mean, is there any way they can get this done before Friday? And is there any willingness to do a short-term stopgap bill to give more time for them to negotiate?
Even if they reach a deal in principle by Friday, it's almost impossible that they would be able to pass it through both the Senate and the House. That would just be a huge undertaking. But if there is some good faith negotiations going on, Democrats might be willing to support a short gap spending bill. It just depends on how long it would be. Certainly that's something Republicans are going to try to pass regardless because the clock is ticking. And this agency, Department of Homeland Security, a critical agency that is set to shut down at Friday at midnight.
Okay, Mel, let's turn now to Julia for more on her side of all of this. And Julia, I want to turn to the reporting that you did for your upcoming book, Undue Process, about the Trump administration's deportation program. You interviewed the White House border czar Tom Homan over the summer, where he forewarned about the fallout we've been seeing over Minneapolis. What did he tell you?
That's right, Ryan. When I spoke with Tom Homan on June 16th, we had no idea the position he would be in now, taking over from Greg Bovino in Minneapolis after the Trump administration's tough tactics ended, of course, in the fatal shooting of 2 U.S. citizens. And what he said then really explains a lot about his tactics now and was a warning sign that was not heeded up until those fatal shootings. What he said to me is, I think the vast majority of the American people think criminal illegal aliens need to leave. And if we stick to that prioritization, I think we keep the faith of the American people. Ryan, he said this in many different iterations over the course of our interview that day. That was just as the operations that really began to sweep immigrants in Home Depot parking lots, the garment district of LA began. And he was saying that he thought that people would have more room to complain. He was worried about losing the faith of the American people. And he said that they needed to focus on their operations targeted on people who had committed crimes. And this was just as this other strategy to do this real broad sweeps of places that Greg Bovino was leading had really come into power and into favor by the administration. Now we've seen a switch, and Homan is trying to put the genie back in the bottle and chart this new course. Of course, it's in the aftermath of these two shootings and as those negotiations really ratchet up in intensity on the Hill.
And you've also been reporting that ICE is plowing ahead with plans to build and buy mega warehouses to keep detained immigrants. How does that fit with these targeted operations?
Well, exactly right. It seems that why would they be spending all of this money on mega warehouses that could hold as many as 8,000 immigrants? For context, the country's largest federal prisons hold 4,000. So that would double that amount. But we know that they've already taken contractors out to these warehouses. They were built to be Amazon warehouses. There's one right there in Surprise, Arizona. And they've also gone to places that were built to be server farms, these huge warehouses that are sitting empty across the country. ICE wants to do something unusual, and they want the government to buy these and have them run by contractors. Previously, contractors acquire the space, and they make sure that it's outfitted and the security can be provided and that they can staff it. So a lot of contractors we've spoken to, as well as members of Congress, including Republican Senator Roger Wicker, who is concerned about a facility in Mississippi, they say that this could be really unsafe because they wouldn't be able to staff these to the adequate ratios they would need to safely and humanely run an ICE detention center. It also shows there's more money coming. They're putting a lot of money toward this. And of course, they have a lot from the One Big Beautiful Bill and from previous appropriations. But it shows that perhaps a real winding down of this sweeping policy might not be coming anytime soon.
Okay, Mel and Julia, thank you to both of you. We appreciate it.
Now, by the time you see this, expect that some of the particulars may have changed, though right before we came in here to record, things were still at an impasse. But as we're recording this segment, negotiations are taking place, though the prognosis doesn't look great. It's been changing from day to day, but it still seems pretty stuck as we walked up here. Okay, whatever may have happened since we recorded, let's fill in some of the specifics. DHS was created in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks to increase coordination among domestic security agencies. It's composed of a wide range of agencies within the executive branch and has evolved into a somewhat sprawling bureaucratic domain. This bureaucracy operates under the authority of the Secretary of Homeland Security, currently Kristi Noem, who's figured prominently and at times problematically, many have thought, in the public response to immigration enforcement generally and to the shootings in Minneapolis specifically. Now, we'll go into more depth on DHS in just a few minutes. We'll unpack that diagram some.
Right. So the post-Minneapolis calls for changes to DHS led to a brief partial government shutdown after the previous temporary spending authorization lapsed back on January 31st. To end that particular shutdown, Congress passed and the president signed a 2026 government funding package that funds all federal agencies except the Department of Homeland Security, DHS, through September 30th of 2026, which is the end of the government's fiscal year. Now, separately, Congress passed a 2-week short-term spending measure for the Department of Homeland Security, which funded that agency too, but only again through February 13th, while negotiations, as we're talking about, continue on U.S. immigration and customs enforcement accountability measures that Democrats want to add to this funding legislation, like the previous video made clear.
Yeah, something that would catch a ride.
Yeah, catch a ride, to use the term of art there. Democrats and a small but crucial number of Republicans have asked for provisions to rein in ICE and other immigration enforcement agencies as the price of their support for continued funding. That is, for their votes to approve the budget authorization. Now, as we record this segment, that September 13th deadline is very much looming, right? Okay, so let's look at some of their demands. Great. So if you've been following the immigration debate, or even if you remember just our earlier discussion on Unpacking the News, you probably won't have too much trouble linking the items on this Democratic wish list to the criticisms of ICE. So there are 10 overall, but some of the most prominent provisions include things like prohibiting DHS and ICE officers from entering private property without a warrant signed by a judge, prohibiting ICE and other immigration agents from wearing masks or other face coverings that hide their identities during enforcement operations, requiring agents to visibly display their agency name, unique ID number, and last name on their uniforms, and to verbalize this information if it's requested, banning enforcement actions near what we call sensitive locations, which include things like schools, medical facilities, childcare centers, churches, polling places, and courthouses, and requiring immigration enforcement officers to verify that an individual is not a U.S. citizen before they can be held in an immigration detention facility. Okay. Now, from a political perspective, the Democratic proposals are carefully chosen to be ones that most public opinion polling tells us a solid majority of Americans would or do in fact support. So as an example of these political calculations, it's likely that the vast majority of Americans expect law enforcement of any kind to have a warrant in order to search their private property, which you all might know by now is a right guaranteed by the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. So not like a small thing, right? But the specifics of the Democratic demands that we're focused on here are less important than noting how the politics of shutdowns can connect us to our understanding of how American government works, or why it sometimes just stops working, right?
So with that in mind, we have two subjects we want to link to the course in this Unpacking the News segment. The first is the connections of shutdown politics to the institutional discussion that we're having in the course right now, that is, the legislative and executive branch modules. And second, how the close division of power between the two parties in Congress shapes how the legislative and executive branches operate at the national level. Now, this is particularly true where immigration policy is involved, as we've seen and we'll see more in this segment. Now, at a very simple level, this episode of Shutdown Politics, like all others, illustrates what the separation of powers and checks and balances look like in practice. If the power to make laws and authorize spending, and the power to carry out those laws and administer the spending of those funds were not separated by the Constitution, well, this conflict wouldn't exist. That is, a conflict between members of the legislative branch with the executive branch over the administration of laws and the spending of congressionally approved funds just wouldn't happen if one or the other branches alone had the power to decide how much the government would spend and for what purposes, and the power to carry out the programs and policies that are created by that spending. Now, this points to an inherent difficulty that we should know by now is purposefully baked into any disagreement or even conflict between the leadership of the executive branch, that is the president, and members of Congress or the legislative branch. The checks and balances that are baked into the Constitution give each branch the ability to obstruct the other, if, and really when, they fail to agree. So in the case of DHS funding, members of Congress are using their funding authority, and in this case, their ability explicitly to withhold funding, to attempt to shape how the executive branch goes about enforcing existing immigration law through DHS, an agency that is within the executive branch. Meanwhile, the president is using both his informal and his formal powers to push back against the demands of these legislators. Now, examples of this might include using the bully pulpit to promote the reasons for his immigration policies, and we've seen that, and his goals, and to try to put his political opponents on the defensive. And, of course, the president has the institutional formal power to veto any legislation that the Congress passes that he disagrees with, or at least, kind of can't live with. And in a closely divided Congress, the members who disagree with the president can't back away any further after that because the numbers don't exist to override a potential veto. Remember, it takes a 2/3 supermajority in both houses to overturn a presidential veto, and the votes just aren't there. The centrality of DHS as part of the federal bureaucracy that affects more than just immigration is a critical factor, though, in understanding the politics here, and why Congress's ability to withhold funding for DHS potentially attracts negative public attention. and creates political pressure on elected officials to make sure that the funding actually happens.
That's right.
Now, the Department of Homeland Security is a significant, high-impact component of the federal government. If we look more closely at this diagram and focus on the most active agencies that are highlighted here, we see that while narrower in impact than a shutdown of the entire federal government, DHS ceasing large portions of its operations would potentially impact not just the actions of immigration and border-related agencies under the Department of Homeland Security, which is kind of the issue at hand, but would also affect several other agencies that affect many Americans' day-to-day lives. Which is to say, this discussion could impact you beyond its connection to your government class.
That's right. So one of the real pressure points of every modern government shutdown, and including the record-setting episode last fall, is the Transportation Security Administration, or TSA for short. Now, if you travel by air, you go through some form of TSA checkpoint. Now, TSA airport security personnel are actually required to work without pay during a government shutdown, but the lines do run more slowly because TSA personnel, now working without pay, begin calling in sick more and more frequently, and generally speaking are not necessarily motivated to run those lines very quickly, which is what we saw during the last shutdown. Now, in addition to the delays that this adds to travel, there's a real impact to people's sense of safety and security while traveling, as they are sort of faced with these consistent discussions about airport security staff that dominate repeated news cycles. Another agency with real impact, if less widespread than the TSA, is the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA for short, which provides both short-term and longer-term relief to areas struck by emergencies like natural disasters, such as fires, severe weather, and the like. Now, disruptions in FEMA support, and especially relief, tend to get a lot of attention in the media, and the agency itself is already a frequent object of criticism. And well, not to be crass or insensitive here, any emergency, whether at an airport, in the skies, or as a result of some kind of an act of God, as we say, in other words, a natural disaster, some kind of significant weather event, that's then made worse by a slow, ineffective, or unavailable response due to a government shutdown, is just really, really bad for politicians seeking re-election. It's kind of like a rule number one for politics. Yeah. So remember, 2026 is a midterm election year in which all members of the House and a third of the U.S. Senate are up for re-election. So this is a big deal. Now, you might be wondering, why or even how are the branches both in conflict if there are Republican majorities in both houses of Congress, and we also know that the president is a Republican? And not only that, one, as we discussed in the executive branch module, who is very willing to aggressively wield the powers that he already has. The answer to this is, which is a very reasonable question, but the answer has three components, so a little bit complicated. The first factor that makes it difficult for a Republican-led Congress and a Republican president to simply pass these bills without any threat of a shutdown is the very narrow advantage that Republicans enjoy in Congress and the difficulties this creates for both the Republican leaders in both chambers of Congress and the White House to coordinate. This is especially true in the U.S. House of Representatives, where Republicans currently hold a very slim 218 to 214 seat majority. This means that the House Republican leadership, headed by Speaker of the House Mike Johnson, can only afford to lose 2 Republicans if they want to maintain a majority of the vote. Only 2. While the vast majority of Republican members tend to back the president, this slim margin means that the Republican leadership needs support to be all but unanimous. And the members themselves, being strategic as they are politicians, they're aware of this, right? So any member that wants to hold out for changes in legislation or for some other kind of political reward, benefit, perk, whatever you want to say, only needs to find one other ally to prevent that legislation from moving forward unless their demands are met. Well, the party division in the Senate is not quite as close as it is in the House, with 53 Republicans and 45 Democrats, which practically we boost to a block of 47 Democrats because of the 2 independent senators who align themselves with the Democrats on most votes. The Republican Majority Leader, John Thune, can only therefore lose 3 Republican votes. This would make for a 50-50 tie in which case the Vice President, Republican J.D. Vance, gets to cast the tie-breaking vote. And remember, moving legislation in the Senate very frequently requires a 3/5 majority, which is actually 60 members if everyone is present. This makes it even more difficult for the Republican majority to win votes without compromising on some issues with at least some Democrats. And that's only if Republicans reach a consensus, which really isn't always the case.
Now, in the case of DHS funding, the centrality of immigration policy to funding DHS creates other difficulties for Republicans. Now, on one hand, there are very sharp differences between Republican and Democratic members of Congress about the increase in deportation efforts implemented by the Trump administration and the way that they're doing that. These differences reflect disagreements and differences in the views of their respective partisan voters. So, for example, if we look at public opinion in Texas, these differences are pretty stark and they're pretty consistent over time. So, if you look at this graphic, and there's a lot going on here, but you can figure it out. This slide presents a set of responses from Texas Politics Project polling over the last decade, and the responses are to the question, do you agree or disagree with the following statement? Undocumented immigrants currently living in the United States should be deported immediately. Now, we rely on the responses to this question a lot in teaching and public-facing discussions because it provides such a good, clear illustration of the huge gulf between Democrats and Republicans' attitudes about immigration enforcement and immigration overall. Now, the results are pretty straightforward. The lines represent the share of Texas voters who agreed with the idea of immediate deportation of anyone currently in the U.S. illegally, but separated out by party. The red line represents the share of Republicans who agreed with the statement. And the blue line represents the share of Democrats who agreed. Now, no offense, we hit independents just to make the contrast between partisans more clear. If the independents were there, they'd be more or less in the middle.
More or less in the middle, yeah.
So, in case you're wondering. Now, we don't have to go into the actual numbers in much detail to make the point that for over a decade, large majorities of Republicans have supported immediately deporting anyone in the country without documentation, that is illegally, and that in terms of thinking about the current partisan conflict over immigration enforcement, the gap between the two has actually grown wider over the last 2 years. Now, we'll come back to some of the possible explanations for that later in the semester.
Yeah, but there isn't, on the other hand, when we're talking about partisan views of immigration that is very specific to the current moment and the more aggressive immigration enforced policies being implemented by the Trump administration. There is hesitation among some Republican voters in response to the more aggressive tactics that have been deployed, leading to the belief that immigration enforcement has gone too far or been too aggressive in the wake of events in Minnesota in particular. So let's look at a couple of specific results from our June 2025 poll of Texas voters. And the date here is important. At this point last summer, the Trump administration had already started implementing more aggressive efforts to arrest undocumented migrants, but this was before the killings in Minnesota really, I think, charged the issue and really brought it to the front of mind for a lot of people. So in that June poll, we asked Texans about a variety of enforcement tactics being used by the administration. So let's look at a couple results from that survey.
Made with these very hands.
These very hands you're looking at, these brains. Okay. So we asked the participants in the poll whether they supported or opposed, quote, arresting people who are in the country illegally while they're at church. Now, here are the results by party following our usual color scheme. So the blue bars are the shares of Democrats, the red, the share of Republicans, and gray, the share of independents who chose each of those response options on the bottom there. So if you combine the strongly and somewhat responses, what you can see is at first cut, you'll notice that much more Democrats are much more opposed and much more intensely so than Republicans, right? 89% of Democrats oppose immigration enforcement taking place at churches, with only 5% saying that they're supportive of those kinds of efforts. Now, a majority of Republicans, 55%, support immigration enforcement at churches, with 36% opposed. But this level of support is much lower when compared to the share of Republicans who express support for the immediate deportation of anyone in the country illegally, which was 86%, as you see when we're referring back to the slide. So that's a full 30-point drop from those who said they want all deportations immediately, right?
Pretty big, not a statistical glitch.
No. And here, if we look at another result, we see this isn't just about church. Now, again, we're not going to go into a ton of detail here, but we can see a similar level of comparatively diminished support among Republican voters for arresting immigrants at a hospital, for example. And again, we can look at another one. When we look at arresting undocumented immigrants at school, even lower. Here, in fact, almost certainly a function about the enforcement efforts being associated with or targeted children. But here we see an even bigger drop in support for these enforcement efforts. So what do we make of this? Why go down what I'm sure some of you probably think is something of a rabbit hole here? Well, what this shows is why the public opinion dynamics of immigration enforcement puts a real strain on the efforts of congressional leaders to maintain the uniform support they need among their Republican members. Despite attitudes among Republican voters that are supportive of the broad goal of deporting anyone in the country illegally, Republican support drops and opposition grows for specific tactics that may seem heavy-handed. And remember, those results were from June, 6 months before the killing of activists in Minneapolis. So these doubts among Republican voters fuel similar doubts among Republican members of Congress, which is, in and of itself, a form of responsiveness.
The way it's supposed to work, theoretically.
Theoretically. This helps explain why some of those Republicans are signaling some willingness to negotiate on some of the Democratic conditions for authorizing DHS funding. In fact, one of the Democratic demands is, as we already said, to prohibit enforcement actions near schools, medical facilities, churches, and polling places. And on the flip side, you should notice that Democratic voters are unified in their views of these prohibitions. And you could scroll back and have a look if you want, which makes Republican voters' doubt even more of a problem. Democratic voters' relative consensus makes threats to Republican consensus on the particulars even more problematic. In short, it makes it harder for Republicans to attract any Democratic votes to cover any sort of defections on their own side, and it puts more pressures on them to accept some of the Democratic conditions. Now, just to be clear, majorities of Republicans still support these tactics in Texas. In recent national polling conducted after the Minneapolis killing, so here afterwards, nearly half of Republicans, 49%, said that ICE's tactics were, quote, about right, along with another 21% who said they were, quote, not forceful enough. And yet, more than 1 in 5 Republican voters, 22%, said the tactics were, quote, too forceful, with another 9% not sure. So we can see how, if we dig below the surface to understand how the separation of powers is at play in the current disputes over DHS funding, we can see that dynamics both between and within the parties are also playing a key role. The result is a situation that is very difficult to resolve. Continued support among Republican voters for increased enforcement, even after the killings, makes it difficult for Republican legislators in Congress to consider defying the White House and compromising with Democrats in order to pass the DHS funding. But there are just enough doubts about the policy to make maintaining Republican unity extremely difficult, especially given a Republican electorate that remains supportive of the president, who has strongly championed this approach to migration and immigration enforcement.
And in fact, a huge part of his political brand at this point. Anything else you want to add? Any updates? Anything? Any other stray thoughts? There's a lot in there, but...
No, I mean, I think, I will say, as we're getting closer to the exam, this is a really good example of how I think a lot of these concepts that we're talking about play out in real life, and why, I think part of the purpose of this class is not to shy away from some of the politics of this, because in a lot of ways, we have these institutional features, and in and of themselves, they do give a pretty dry, clear explanation. Well, there's a disagreement between the executive.
Well, people aren't getting along.
Sure, and it's like, but aren't they the same party? And why? And it's like, well, let's. And as you dig in, you start to understand a little bit better how I think the politics, I think you are all probably a little bit more aware of at the moment, intersect with some of these institutional features that we're trying to introduce you to.
Yeah, and this issue is not going away, and we've talked about immigration already to some degree in enforcement, and it kind of backs in this, but it's so front and center right now, and in an election year. So.
Right.
Okay then, well, with that's it for this edition of Unpacking the News. Be sure to review the video and then take the Unpacking the News quiz that follows this. So do well on the quiz. Hope you enjoyed this and it was helpful, and we'll see you again soon.